Hello everyone, and welcome to the 231st episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring Ego from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I've covered a few villainous fathers in my time, but I've yet to release a video on one on Father's Day, so this year I figured it was about time I did, and it seemed only too fitting that I do so by covering one of the most diabolical fathers to ever grace the silver screen, the god of egotism himself and the would-be destroyer of the entire universe. Ego is a pretty fascinating character, one whose actions and plans reminded me of this colorful character, only a bit less scummy and a lot more nefarious. A man who certainly deserves no praise on this day dedicated to fatherhood. But to all you fathers out there who aren't planning to destroy everything in the universe and replace it with images of yourself, which I'm hoping is all of you, I hope you have a happy Father's Day and enjoy this analysis of a man who is but a mockery of what it truly means to be a father. Now without further ado, let's begin. Being a god isn't always all it's cracked up to be, especially in Ego's case. Born a disembodied brain floating through the universe millions of years in the past, Ego the Celestial spent many of those millions of years in this state before he learned to control the molecules around him and bind them to his will, which eventually resulted in his creation of his paradisal planet that served all at once as his home, his body, and his fortress. After doing so, he began to desire to find meaning in his life, which led him to wonder whether or not he was alone in the universe, and in an effort to find out if that was the case, he created for himself a body modeled after what he thought biological life would look like, which was somehow a human body, and set out into the unknown to find out whether or not he was truly alone, which unfortunately for the rest of the universe, he discovered that he wasn't. After he wandered for some time and met species after species, and being after being, Ego ended up feeling only one thing: disappointment. And now that he'd discovered that this was all that life in this universe had to offer, he felt bereft of purpose, which then led him to formulating his dreaded expansion plan, the destruction of all life in the universe, so he could remake it all into reflections of himself. Now that's an insane conclusion to make, but such an egotistical conclusion forming in the mind of a being named Ego doesn't seem as insane as it might be otherwise. However, it's insanity that is partly to blame for him coming to this conclusion in the first place, an insanity that was born from loneliness. Solitary confinement is a practice used in many different places in our world as a form of punishment, and over time, it's steadily become more and more controversial because of just how harmful it can be to a person's well-being, with only a few days or weeks spent in such a state liable to permanently alter one's psyche in various terrifying ways. In a way, Ego spent much of his existence in a form of solitary confinement, but instead of having to suffer such torment for days, weeks, months, or even decades, he had to suffer it for millions upon millions of years. And though he was a god, even a god isn't immune from suffering the effects of a lonesome existence that stretched over a period of time far beyond our imagining. So it's no wonder a godlike creature who spent countless years with himself developed a level of selfishness that can only be described as insanity and the maddening ego that would become his namesake. Sure, he had the beauty of the stars and galaxies to keep his senses partly entertained, and he did have his efforts to better himself to keep his mind occupied. But even the most awe-inspiring beauties can get old if you spend millions of years looking at them, and work is not something that can keep loneliness from being as oppressive as it is. These things alone may have been enough to drive Ego to villainy, but it would be that disappointment I mentioned earlier that would be the ignition for the malicious fire he wished to engulf the universe in. But from what stemmed this disappointment? If I had to guess, I'd say commonality. When Ego set out to find life in the universe, he was hoping to meet like minds and bodies with whom he could connect with and share his experiences and pain with to forge something greater than the lonesome existence he had been forced to endure. But when he did, he found that there was nothing in this universe that had anything more to offer him than anything else he had already experienced on his own, and there was no one out there that he had anything in common with, and nothing that was more magnificent than he was. In fact, a lot of what he encountered was surely abhorrent, with war, disease, suffering, and all the sins of sapient beings souring what otherwise may have been a grand reveal of a universe made better with all that can be found within it. So when he was met with this disappointment, Ego's mind wandered back where it had been for so long, with himself and everything that he was and could do, things that, as far as he was aware, no other being could accomplish or even hope to live up to. So with his ability to shape matter as he willed, he chose to attempt to make the entire universe into something better, the planned genocide of all organic matter and the transformation of all inorganic matter into manifestations of himself, an evil in the disguise of deific purpose that would finally satisfy a god warped by isolation and the ego he developed from it. But there was a problem. A universal task like this required universal power, and Ego, though a god, wasn't a god of that nature, and so he decided to find a new source of godlike power to aid him, and he did so the only way he knew how, by creating one. And not long after formulating this plot, he set out to mate with thousands upon thousands of women from various species over thousands of years, and when his children matured, he made sure to check whether or not he had passed on his powers to them. But each time he did, he was met with that same disappointment he felt with the rest of the universe, promptly destroying each and every one of them after testing them, something he admitted to Quill in the most callous and flippant way that reflects his nature as a being who believes himself to be superior to all others. Though to his credit, he apparently used a painless method to murder his children, if that counts for anything. All that would change when he heard of Quill's survival from his brush with the Power Stone, rightly deducing that only a being with the power of a god could be capable of surviving such an ordeal. The one creature in this universe who could come close to being his equal, and not the disappointment that he'd felt everything else in this universe was. The one person who could finally make him feel as if he wasn't alone anymore. And so he journeyed to find the man that could only be his son, and the final component of his grand plan. It's here on Ego's body planet that we learn the extent of his machinations and the way in which he orchestrated the murder of Quill's mother by planting a tumor in her brain, another admission that he delivers with almost no emotion. But it's here that we also eventually get to see Ego's end, the efforts of a son imbued with the power of a god who rejected him and his heritage, a son who could not bear to facilitate the end of life as it's known for the sake of a man who had murdered his mother, countless others, and who planned to murder everyone else in the universe at that. But in rifling through his story and ambitions, we're granted a few enduring lessons that only emphasize just how horrendous this man was, and how tragic. Ego's story is a reminder of the dangers of isolation and loneliness, and the great harm they do to a person. But it's also a reminder of the dangers of selfishness. In some ways, Ego was destined to become the selfish man he was. He was a man who spent eons with only himself, and living only for himself. And when he encountered other life, he found that they were so far below his greatness that his existence was the only true purpose in the universe, the all-consuming ego who was going to make right all the wrong that is existence. I've said it many times before in previous episodes, but at the root of every evil action is selfishness. To be selfish is not evil, but evil is always selfish, as being consumed with yourself and your wants and needs without regard for those of others is a big part of what leads a person to evil. And so it makes all too much sense that a man who was essentially the embodiment of selfishness would endeavor to commit an act of evil so great that it would be nothing less than the ultimate crime. Not even Thanos' plans could hold a candle to what Ego had planned. For at least Thanos was attempting to do what he thought would make the universe a better place for everyone left living in it. I guess in a sense, Ego was too, but he wasn't trying to make the universe a better place for anyone else but himself. And you know what? He may just have gotten away with it, were it not for the fact that Ego is always accompanied by another poison: arrogance. When Ego revealed to Quill that it was he who killed his mother, that was his greatest mistake. Up until that point, he'd proved himself to be a master of manipulation and a man so tactical that he was capable of nearly pulling off a diabolical scheme that spanned the entire universe. But in revealing the truth of Meredith's death, he made a blunder that belied that intelligence he had cultivated over so many years. Maybe he was so careless with his admission here because he wasn't being careless, but was purposely testing his son to see whether or not he was worthy of being the only being who would be there at his side to see the grandeur of his vision unfold. That could be true, but I'd wager that it was simple arrogance that caused him to tell Quill what he had done. Why? Because Quill was an extension of himself, and so he assumed that his own flesh and blood, the inheritor of his power, would also share his ego, that same sense of godlike self-importance that made him believe that no being in this universe was worth any more than the dust on his shoes. And it would be this deranged arrogance, an arrogance derived from an ego as large as the universe itself, that would be his end. But in coming to this realization, we can find even more understanding about this man through exploring the tragedy of Ego's character and how he almost escaped his maddening nature. Because Ego was born and lived alone for so many millions of years, he never learned what it meant to be connected to other sapient beings. He never had parents to teach him the value of life, or to nurture him and express love in all the ways that only a parent can. He never knew the joys of friendship, or the sometimes frustrating bond forged between siblings and other family members. So to be as arrogant, callous, and egotistical as he was only makes sense, and it's the tragedy of a man so disconnected from everything that it means to be alive and to live in this universe that guided his mind towards the dreaded conclusion that it made. And though that is the greatest tragedy of his character, there is more still, for Ego had the opportunity to render that tragedy nothing more than a distant memory. When Ego is speaking to Quill about his mother, he has this to say.
You said you loved my mother.
And that I did. My river lily, who knew all the words to every song that came over the radio. I returned to Earth to see her 3 times, and I knew if I returned a 4th, I'd never leave. The expansion, reason for my very existence would be over, so I did what I had to do. But it broke my heart to put that tumor in her head.
Ego had almost understood. He almost felt what it was like to love and to be connected to someone other than himself. And he could have had a taste of everything that makes life in this universe worth living. But when given the opportunity to do so, he still chose to cling only to himself and his dreadful vision for the universe. And really, perhaps that's all he could have done. For a being who spent millions of years never feeling a connection to anyone and never knowing what it means to love may have been incapable of pushing themselves past that threshold. But if anything, this admission proves that it may have been hard for him to do so, but not impossible. Sometimes that thing you're searching for your whole life is right there by your side all along, and you don't even know it. It was there, right in front of him, a purpose beyond anything he could have dreamed. And these wise words from Quill reinforces just how close Ego was to becoming more than the single-minded maniac that he was, and how simple it would have been for him to find both the purpose he craved and an end to his long history of loneliness. But in the end, he didn't come close enough. And as he was sent off into the unknown by the Guardians, he remained the manipulative, merciless, and flippantly cruel man that he was. A lonely mind trapped in a lonely fantasy that was so obsessed with itself that he would have rather stewed for all eternity surrounded by reminders of his greatness than take even a moment to truly grasp what life is and how wonderful it can be when you learn to appreciate it and what it has to offer you, for better or for worse. And for being a man who was more than happy to destroy every single aspect of this universe purely for his own benefit, Ego will surely go down as not just one of the most vile fathers in all of fiction, but one of the most evil characters ever created. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you've enjoyed. What are your thoughts on Ego? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.